On September 17, 1940, a German U-boat attacked the SS city of Benares in the North Atlantic. The ship was carrying British children, 90 of them, ages 5 to 15, evacuees fleeing the London Blitz. Their parents had kissed them goodbye in Liverpool 4 days earlier, believing Canada would be safer than war-torn England. The children never arrived. U-48, commanded by Heinrich Bleichrodt, fired 3 torpedoes at the passenger vessel. The final torpedo struck the stern at 10:03 that evening. The city of Benares sank in 31 minutes. Of the 90 child evacuees aboard, 77 died in the freezing Atlantic waters, more than 600 miles from shore. Some drowned when the torpedo ripped through their sleeping quarters. Others froze to death in lifeboats during the night. Some were never recovered. The sinking of the city of Benares made headlines across America. In Hollywood, a 25-year-old Austrian actress read the reports with rising anger and resolve. Her name was Hedy Lamarr. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer called her the most beautiful woman in the world, a label that followed her everywhere: magazine covers, publicity stills, fan mail. She had starred in hit films since arriving in Hollywood 2 years earlier: Algiers, Lady of the Tropics, I Take This Woman, Comrade X, Boomtown. Her face was everywhere. Her salary was $500 a week. She lived in a sprawling home in Beverly Hills with mountain views and a swimming pool. She attended premieres with Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy. She wore gowns by Adrian and jewelry worth more than automobiles. Photographers fought for images of her face, those legendary features that fashion magazines described as mathematically perfect. Batman co-creator Bob Kane later cited her as a primary inspiration for Catwoman. Plastic surgeons reported that more women requested Hedy Lamarr's features than those of any other woman in history. But none of that mattered. Not the money, not the mansion, not the fame, not the beauty. Children were dead because of German U-boats. And Hedy Lamarr knew something almost no one in Hollywood understood. She knew how weapons functioned. She knew how torpedoes were guided. And she knew exactly why those children had died. The U-boat that sank the city of Benares used a standard German torpedo, wire-guided at first, then free-running. The British had been experimenting with radio-controlled torpedoes. They wanted weapons that could track submarines, change course, and hunt their targets. But there was a problem, a fatal flaw that was killing Allied sailors, evacuees, and merchant crews every single day. Radio-controlled torpedoes could be jammed. German submarines carried radio detection equipment. When they sensed a guidance signal, they could jam the frequency, block the transmission, and turn the torpedo into a useless hunk of metal that sank harmlessly into the depths. Worse still, they could spoof the signal, send false commands, reverse the torpedo's course, and guide it back toward the ship that launched it. The Atlantic was becoming a graveyard. In the first 9 months of 1940, German submarines sank 585 Allied ships, 2 million tons of shipping, thousands of sailors, soldiers, civilians, and now children. Children who should have been safe. Hedy folded the newspaper and walked to the telephone. She needed to speak to someone who understood invention, someone who thought differently. She called George Antheil. George Antheil was not a typical Hollywood composer. He was 40 years old, balding, eccentric, and known throughout the music world as the enfant terrible of composition. He had written Ballet Mécanique, a piece for 16 synchronized player pianos that caused riots when it premiered in Paris in 1926. He had worked with James Joyce and Ezra Pound. He had composed music many people called unlistenable. He had moved to Hollywood in 1936 because he needed reliable income. Antheil and Hedy had met at a dinner party 2 months earlier. They discovered they were neighbors. They discovered they both approached problems differently from most people. They discovered they could talk for hours about ideas, inventions, and how things worked. When Antheil arrived at Hedy's house that evening, she showed him the newspaper. She told him about the city of Benares. She explained torpedo guidance and radio jamming. She told him there had to be a solution. What neither of them yet understood was that the conversation they were about to have would transform warfare, telecommunications, and the future of wireless technology. First, however, Hedy needed to explain where her knowledge came from. And that required going back 4 years to Vienna, to a mansion, and to a man who treated her as property.
Hetty was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler on November 9, 1914, in Vienna, Austria.
Her father, Emil Kiesler, was a successful bank director, educated, curious, and mechanically minded.
He took young Hedwig on long walks through Vienna, pointing out streetcars, printing presses, automobiles.
He explained how gears meshed, how pistons moved, how electricity flowed. He taught her to see the machinery hidden inside the world.
At age 5, Hetty dismantled her music box.
She wanted to know how the cylinder caused the pins to produce different notes. She laid every piece on the floor, studied each component, learned how they fit together, then reassembled it perfectly. It still played. By 12, Hetty was strikingly beautiful.
She won a beauty contest.
By 16, she was studying theater. By 18, she starred in a Czech film called Ecstasy that caused an international scandal because she appeared nude. The film was banned in many countries. The Pope condemned it.
Adolf Hitler banned it in Germany.
But everyone in Europe knew who Hetty Kiesler was, including Fritz Mandl.
Fritz Mandl was one of the wealthiest men in Austria.
He ran Hürtenberger Patronenfabrik, the third largest munitions manufacturer in Europe.
He supplied ammunition to Italy, Hungary, and Austria.
He socialized with fascist leaders.
He attended gatherings with Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler.
He was 33 years old, and he decided he wanted to marry the beautiful young actress from the scandalous film.
On August 10, 1933, 18-year-old Hetty Kiesler married Fritz Mandl at the Karlskirche in Vienna.
She converted to Catholicism for the ceremony. She wore white. Photographers crowded outside the church. It looked like a fairy tale. It was a prison. Mandl was obsessively controlling. He restricted where Hetty could go, monitored whom she could see, dictated what she could do. He attempted to buy up every copy of Ecstasy to erase evidence of her past. He reportedly spent the equivalent of $6 to $8 million in today's money purchasing prints from theaters and collectors across Europe. He failed. The film was too widely distributed, too infamous. But he succeeded in isolating his wife. He moved her to Schloss Schwarzenau, their castle 60 miles outside Vienna, a beautiful prison with servants, gardens, and mountain views, but still a prison. Hetty later described the marriage as unbearable.
Mandl was jealous, possessive, paranoid.
He suspected every man who looked at her. He hired people to watch her. He controlled her money, her correspondence, and her every movement. She was forbidden to continue acting.
She was not allowed to travel alone.
She was not allowed to have friends he did not approve of. She was a trophy. A possession, the beautiful
actress he had won.
But Mandl made one critical catastrophic mistake in his
treatment of Hetty.
He underestimated her intelligence and he brought her to his business meetings.
Mandl was vain about
his beautiful wife. He enjoyed watching other men envy him. He would host elaborate dinners at Schloss Schwarzenau.
For German military officials, Italian weapons manufacturers, Hungarian buyers, Austrian engineers, tables laden with expensive food and wine, servants in
formal dress, and at Mandl's side, the exquisite Hetty in designer gowns, silent
and ornamental. Mandl expected Hetty to sit quietly during these dinners, look
beautiful, smile, pour wine, participate in small talk about weather and art and
music, but never business, never politics, never weapons. Women were not
supposed to understand such things.
Women were decoration.
That was the belief system of every man in that
dining room.
What they didn't realize was that Hetty was absorbing everything. The conversations would start after
dinner when the men retired to Mandl's study with brandy and cigars. Mandl
wanted his wife present. She added glamour to the room, made the occasion feel more important.
The men barely noticed her sitting in the corner.
They assumed she was too beautiful to be intelligent, too focused on fashion and
films to understand technical discussions.
They talked freely while she listened. She heard German torpedo engineers explain the limitations of wire-guided systems.
The wires restricted range to a few hundred meters. Any longer and the wire would break. The torpedo would go unguided. Miss the target. The engineers wanted radio guidance, longer range, more
flexibility, but radio had problems. She heard Italian designers discuss radio
frequency jamming, how easy it was to detect a guidance signal, how simple it
was to broadcast interference on the same frequency, how effectively it neutralized radio-guided weapons. The British were experimenting with radio torpedoes. The Germans were jamming them successfully. The Italians wanted better
jamming equipment. She heard Austrian acoustic specialists explain homing
torpedoes that listened for ship engine sounds.
Promising but unreliable false targets, background noise, whales and dolphins that triggered the sensors. One torpedo had circled back and nearly struck its launching submarine because it detected the wrong sound. Meeting after meeting, dinner after dinner, Hetty sat quietly while these men explained the cutting edge of weapons technology. Mundell's associates assumed she understood nothing.
They were spectacularly wrong. Hetty had been taking things apart since she was 5 years old. Her father had taught her to see machinery as puzzles, gears, springs, levers, circuits, how they fit together, how they worked, what they
accomplished.
She had the kind of mind that visualized mechanisms, that understood systems, that solved problems. She just happened to also be stunningly beautiful.
The men in Mundell's study couldn't conceive that beauty and intelligence existed in the same person.
Their blindness was Head's advantage.
For 4 years from 1933 to 1937, Hedy Lamarr received an education in weapons technology from some of
Europe's leading experts. For 4 years, she built a knowledge base that would eventually change history.
And for
4 years, she planned her escape.
The details of how Hetty escaped from Fritz Mandel are disputed and contradictory. Multiple versions exist. Her own accounts varied.
Some stories say she disguised herself as one of her maids, wore the servants' uniform, slipped out during a party when the house was crowded with guests, walked past security guards who thought she was staff. Some accounts say she drugged her lady's maid with sleeping pills,
took the woman's clothes and identification, left in a car with vegetables being delivered to Vienna. Other versions are simpler.
Some say she convinced Mundell to let her wear all her jewelry to a dinner at the opera in Vienna.
Told him
she wanted to make an impression, wanted everyone to see how well he treated her. Then during intermission, she simply
disappeared. Walked out of the opera house wearing diamonds worth a fortune.
Got in a taxi, went to the train station, took the night train to Paris. The truth probably contains elements of all these stories.
What is certain is this. In August 1937, Hetty Kiesler left Vienna. She left Fritz Mundell. She left Austria. She left her entire life behind. She was 22 years old.
She had been married for 4 years.
She had absorbed 4 years of weapons intelligence. She had endured 4 years of isolation and control. She was done being Fritz Mundell's trophy wife.
She was done with fascist Europe.
She was done being treated like property instead of a person. She went to Paris first, then to London. In London, she sought a meeting with Louis B. Mayer.
On the ship to New York, Hetty met Louis B. Mayer, the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios.
Mayer was returning from a European talent search. He took one look at Hetty and saw money. He offered her a contract, $500 a week for 7 years.
On one condition, she had to change her
name. Hetty Kiesler sounded too German, too Jewish, too foreign. Mayer renamed
her after silent film star Barbara Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr arrived in Hollywood in September 1938.
Her first film was Allier's opposite Charles Bourre.
The public was mesmerized. Critics called her the most beautiful woman ever filmed.
Warner Brothers animators based Catwoman on her. Plastic. Surgeons reported that more women requested Hedy Lamar's features than anyone else in history. But Hedy was bored. The roles MGM gave her were all the same: exotic temptress, mysterious seductress, glamorous decoration.
She would stand still and look beautiful. She would wear stunning gowns.
She would deliver her lines in that distinctive Austrian accent. She would be photographed from every angle.
And she would go home to an empty house and work on inventions.
Hedy set up a small laboratory in her trailer on the MGM lot.
She kept another workshop at home between takes while other actresses read
magazines or gossiped. Hedy designed.
She invented a tablet that would dissolve in water to create carbonated
soda.
It fizzed but tasted terrible. She redesigned traffic lights.
She improved tissue dispensers.
And she dated Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes was not a typical Hollywood figure.
He was an aviator, an engineer, a billionaire who owned
airlines and built airplanes.
He understood Hedy in a way that other men didn't.
He didn't just see beauty. He saw intelligence.
He gave Hedy a small set of tools and equipment. He took her to his airplane factories.
He showed her
how planes were designed. He introduced her to engineers. He asked for her input
on wing design.
Hedy studied the fastest fish and the fastest birds.
She sketched
a new wing profile combining the streamlined shape of a fish fin with the swept curve of a bird wing.
She showed the design to Hughes. He looked at it for a long time.
Then he said, "You are
a genius."
Hughes gave Hedy something nobody else in Hollywood had given her:
respect for her mind, encouragement to invent, freedom to think. But the relationship ended. Hughes was too unstable, too controlling, too obsessive. Hedy moved on, and then she met George Anthill at a dinner party in August 1940.
They talked about glands at first.
Hedy wanted to enlarge her breasts. She asked Anthill, who had written articles about endocrinology, for advice. The conversation wandered.
They discovered they lived a few blocks apart. They discovered they both loved puzzles. They discovered they both
wanted to help defeat the Nazis. Anthill had his own reasons for hating Germany.
His brother Henry, a United States diplomat in Germany, had been one of the first American casualties of the war. The Nazis had taken over countries Anthill loved: Paris, where he had composed his most famous works; Vienna, where Hedy was born; Berlin, where he had performed. Europe was burning. And both of them felt helpless sitting in Los Angeles making movies and music when
Hedy showed George the newspaper article about the city of Bernard in September 1940. Something clicked.
They started talking about torpedoes, radio guidance, jamming, the technical problems Hedy had learned about in her husband's business meetings, the synchronization challenges
Anthea knew from music.
The problem was elegant in its simplicity, but devastating in its implications. Radio-guided torpedoes operated on a single frequency.
The ship launching the torpedo had a transmitter. The torpedo
had a receiver, both tuned to the same frequency. As the torpedo traveled through the water, the ship sent
guidance commands over that frequency. Turn left 10 degrees.
Turn right 5 degrees, maintain depth, arm the warhead, detonate on impact.
As long as nobody interfered with that frequency, the system worked brilliantly.
The torpedo could change course mid-flight, track a moving target, compensate for currents, hit ships that were evading. It was revolutionary technology, but it had one fatal flaw.
The guidance
frequency was vulnerable. German Hubert carried sophisticated radio detection equipment, arrays of antennas, sensitive
receivers scanning the radio spectrum constantly.
When a British ship fired a radio-guided torpedo, the guidance
Signal lit up German receivers like a spotlight. Within seconds, German radio operators could identify the exact frequency. Within seconds more, they could start broadcasting interference. The interference was simple but effective. Broadcast powerful radio noise on the same frequency the torpedo was using. Overwhelmed the guidance signal. The torpedo's receiver couldn't distinguish between the legitimate commands from the launching ship and the jamming noise from the submarine. The guidance system failed. The torpedo went blind. It would either maintain its last heading or enter a default pattern. Either way, it usually missed. Worse, German operators could sometimes transmit false commands. If they identified the signal protocol, they could send fake guidance instructions, turn the torpedo around, send it back toward the ship that launched it. British crews had reported torpedoes circling back. Sailors watched in horror as their own weapons came hunting them. Some ships had been damaged by their own torpedoes after German interference. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost partly because of this single vulnerability. Radio-guided weapons didn't work. Wire-guided weapons had too limited range. Acoustic homing was unreliable. German submarines could sink Allied ships faster than shipyards could build replacements. Convoys were being devastated. Merchant ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, supplies were going to the bottom. Thousands of sailors were dying, and now children evacuating from the war zones were drowning too. Hedy knew all this from Mundel's business meetings. Antel knew synchronization from his decade of work with player pianos and mechanical music. Together they had an insight that seemed almost too simple. What if the guidance signal didn't stay on one frequency? What if it moved? What if it hopped? Imagine a conversation where both people agreed in advance to switch rooms every 10 seconds. They start in room 1. After 10 seconds, they move to room 7, then room 32, then room 3, then room 68. The sequence appears random, but if both people have the same list, they stay together. They can keep talking. Anyone trying to eavesdrop would only hear fragments. By the time they found the speakers in one room, the speakers would be somewhere else. That was frequency hopping. The transmitter and receiver would agree in advance on a sequence of frequencies. They would switch frequencies together multiple times per second. The sequence would appear random to anyone listening, but both the ship and the torpedo would have identical lists. They would hop together, stay synchronized, continue communicating. The enemy would never catch up. Hedy and George started meeting regularly in September 1940. They worked in the evenings after their day jobs. Hedy would finish filming at MGM. George would finish composing. They would meet at Hed's home in Bear or at George's apartment. They would work for hours sketching diagrams, calculating frequencies, designing mechanisms. The first challenge was selecting the frequencies. They needed enough frequencies that the hopping pattern wouldn't repeat quickly, but not so many that synchronization became impossible. George suggested 88, the same number as keys on a piano. It was familiar. It was manageable. It provided enough variation. They decided on 88 frequencies spread across the radio spectrum suitable for underwater communication. The second challenge was the switching mechanism. How do you make a transmitter and a receiver change frequencies together at exactly the same time, multiple times per second, with no room for error? This was where George's experience with ballet mécanique became crucial. In that composition, he had attempted something no one had done before. 16-player pianos synchronized playing together as one massive instrument. The technical challenge had been enormous. Each piano had a paper roll. Holes punched in the paper controlled which keys played. The rolls had to advance at exactly the same speed. If one piano was even slightly faster or slower than the others, the whole composition would collapse into chaos. George had learned everything about synchronization from that project. He knew how pneumatic controls worked, how to design rolls, how to keep mechanisms running at precise speeds, how to make clocks that stayed accurate. All of that knowledge applied directly to frequency hopping. They designed a system using perforated paper rolls, similar to player piano rolls,
but adapted for radio control.
The roll would have 88 positions corresponding to the 88 frequencies. Holes punched in specific positions would determine which frequency to use.
As the roll advanced, the frequency would change.
Both the transmitter and the torpedo would have identical rolls.
Both would advance at the same speed. Both would change frequencies together. The challenge was the clock mechanism. The rolls had to advance at exactly the
same rate.
Any difference, even fractions of a second, would cause the transmitter and receiver to drift apart. They would end up on different frequencies.
Communication would fail. The system required precision.
George
designed a clock mechanism using a small motor and gear train. The motor would spin at a constant rate controlled by a crystal oscillator.
The gears would advance the paper roll at precise
intervals. Both the transmitter and the torpedo would have identical clock mechanisms.
They would start at exactly
the same moment.
They would run at exactly the same speed.
They calculated switching rates. Too slow and the enemy could jam each frequency during the dwell time. Too fast and the radio components couldn't settle on the new frequency before switching again.
They settled on switching several times per
second. Fast enough to avoid jamming, slow enough for the radio hardware to keep up.
Hetty and George worked through the technical details over 3 months.
Hetty contributed the weapons knowledge,
the requirements for underwater communication, the capabilities of German jamming equipment, the
operational constraints of torpedoes. George contributed the synchronization
expertise, the mechanical design, the roll system, the clock mechanisms. By December 1940, they had a complete conceptual design.
They had calculated
the frequencies, designed the rolls, specified the clock mechanism, worked
out the synchronization system, created detailed technical drawings. They were ready to present it to someone who could help.
They submitted their proposal to the National Inventors Council in late
December 1940.
The council had been established earlier that year by President Roosevelt to
collect innovative ideas from civilians for the war effort. Anyone could submit.
Farmers, teachers, engineers, housewives, inventors, anyone with an
idea that might help.
The council was chaired by Charles Kettering, the legendary research director of General
Motors. Kettering had invented the electric starter for automobiles and dozens of other innovations. He understood invention.
He understood taking ideas from unexpected sources. The council received thousands of submissions every month. Most were impractical, some were impossible, many were variations on existing technology, but a few were brilliant.
And the staff knew how to recognize brilliance when they saw it. The Lamar and Hale proposal stood out immediately. The problem it
addressed was real.
The solution was innovative.
The technical approach was sound. The designers understood both the
weapons requirements and the engineering constraints.
This wasn't amateur work. This was
serious invention. According to George Ent's later accounts, Kettering himself
reviewed their proposal.
He was impressed.
He encouraged them to develop it to the point where it could be
patented.
He connected them with Samuel Stewart Makion, a professor of electrical engineering at the California
Institute of Technology. Makion could help them work out the electronic details, refine the radio components, ensure the design was technically feasible. Hetty and George spent early 1941 working with Makion. They revised the design, added detail, solved technical problems, specified components, created full engineering drawings, made it ready for patent. In
June 1941, they were ready to file. Hetty hired Leon and Lyon, a respected patent
law firm. The attorneys drafted the patent application based on Hetty and George's technical specifications. The application ran to 12 pages of detailed technical description and multiple drawings. It described a secret communication system using frequency hopping to guide torpedoes, 88 frequencies, synchronized paper rolls, clock mechanisms. Everything worked out in precise detail. They filed the patent application on June 10, 1941. It listed the inventors as Hetty Kiesler, Markey, and George Antilles. Hetty had remarried screenwriter Gene Markey in 1939.
The marriage was already failing.
It would end in divorce in 1941.
They all did eventually, but for patent
purposes, she was Hetty Kiesler-Markey. The Patent Office reviewed the application through the summer and fall of 1941. Patent examiners studied the technical claims, searched for prior art, evaluated whether the invention was novel and useful. They made some minor objections. Lyon responded, clarified details, revised claims. By early 1942, the patent was ready for approval. On August 11, 1942, the United States Patent Office granted patent number 2292387 to Hetty Kiesler-Markey and George Antheil for a secret communication system. The patent described frequency hopping spread spectrum technology for guiding torpedoes. It specified using piano roll mechanisms for synchronization. It included detailed technical drawings and claims. It was official. Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil were inventors, patent holders, contributors to the war effort. Then reality hit. The United States Navy rejected their invention. The official response came through Navy engineers. The mechanism was too bulky. The piano roll system was too large to fit inside a torpedo. The synchronization was too complicated. The technology was unproven. The whole idea was impractical. There was an unofficial response, too. Multiple sources reported that Hetty was told by Navy officials that if she wanted to help the war effort, she should use her celebrity to sell war bonds. Some accounts quote an official telling her, "You could do more for the war effort by selling kisses than by inventing. Stick to what you're good at. Be beautiful. Be glamorous. Leave the engineering to men." The rejection devastated Hetty. She had invented something she believed could save lives. She had used knowledge gained in the worst period of her life to create something that could help defeat the fascists destroying Europe. She had worked for months with ANF. She had hired patent attorneys. She had submitted detailed technical drawings. She had done everything right, and the Navy dismissed it. They told her to go sell kisses. So she did exactly that, and she did it spectacularly well. Hedy Lamarr became one of the most successful war bond salespeople in American history. The campaign was organized by the United States Treasury Department to finance the war effort. Movie stars traveled the country convincing Americans to buy bonds. Most raised respectable amounts. Hetty raised staggering sums. She traveled to 16 cities in 10 days in September and October 1942. She appeared at rallies in New York, Washington, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. Massive crowds turned out to see her. Thousands of people. They wanted to see the most beautiful woman in the world. They wanted to hear her Austrian accent. They wanted to be near Hollywood glamour. But Hetty gave them more than glamour. She gave them a show designed to sell bonds. At each rally, a sailor would be planted in the audience. Eddie Rodas, a young serviceman, traveled with her. Hetty would flirt with him from the stage, ask the audience if she should give him a kiss. The crowd would cheer. Hetty would say she would kiss him if enough people bought war bonds. The bonds would sell thousands of dollars, tens of thousands. Hetty would kiss Rhodes. The crowd would roar. Then they would move to the next city and do it again. In one legendary evening in Washington, D.C., Hetty auctioned off kisses at $25,000 each. Multiple buyers. The money poured in. In that single night, she raised $7 million. Over the full campaign, she sold $25 million in war bonds adjusted for inflation. That's approximately $343 million in today's currency. One actress, 10 days, $4 billion for the war effort. She also volunteered at the Hollywood Canteen after it opened in October 1942. The Canteen was a club on Coena Boulevard where servicemen could eat, dance, and meet movie stars for free. Hetty served food. She washed dishes. She danced with soldiers and sailors. She signed thousands of autographs. She did everything they asked her to do. Be beautiful. Be helpful. Be inspiring. Don't try to be an engineer. The patent sat in a file cabinet at the Navy Department. George Antheil went back to composing. Hetty went back to making movies. The war continued. U-boat continued sinking ships. Allied torpedoes continued being jammed. People continued dying. The irony was crushing. Hetty had created something that could have saved lives. Instead, she sold kisses. But the story doesn't end there. Technology has its own timeline. Ideas wait. The patent sat dormant through the rest of World War II. It sat dormant through the late 1940s. Then in the 1950s, military engineers working on a completely different problem stumbled onto frequency hopping. The problem was sonobuoys. These were devices dropped from airplanes into the ocean to detect submarines using sonar. The sonobo buoy would listen for submarine engines and propellers. When it detected something, it needed to transmit that information back to the airplane. But if the transmission used a single frequency, the submarine could detect it and jam it. Engineers developing sonobo discovered the Lamar Anthell patent. They realized frequency hopping was exactly what they needed. But by then technology had advanced. Instead of paper rolls, they could use electronics, lightweight transistors instead of bulky mechanical systems. The patent gave them the concept. Modern electronics gave them the implementation. The first operational frequency hopping system was deployed on United States Navy ships in 1962, 20 years after Hetty and George filed their patent. Just in time for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just in time for the moment when the world came closest to nuclear annihilation. October 1962 was the most dangerous month in human history. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. Medium-range ballistic missiles capable of reaching Washington, D.C. in less than 5 minutes. Long-range missiles that could hit any city in the continental United States. Strategic nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida. American U-2 spy planes discovered the missile sites on October 14. President John F. Kennedy was informed on October 16. For 6 days, Kennedy and his advisors debated responses in secret. An invasion of Cuba, airstrikes on the missile sites, a naval blockade, diplomatic pressure. Every option risked escalation. Every option risked nuclear war. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. He announced the discovery of the missiles. He announced a naval quarantine of Cuba. Any Soviet ship carrying weapons to Cuba would be stopped, boarded, turned back. The United States was drawing a line. The quarantine would begin on October 24. The Soviet Union had a choice. Stop their ships. Remove the missiles or defy the blockade, force a confrontation, risk war. On October 24, Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. United States Navy destroyers and cruisers waited. Sailors watched radar screens, tracked the Soviet vessels, prepared for combat. The world held its breath. If the Soviet ships crossed the line, American ships would intercept them. If the Soviets resisted, shots would be fired. If shots were fired, escalation to nuclear weapons became almost inevitable. Then the Soviet ships stopped just short of the quarantine line. They turned around. They went back. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said to National Security Advisor MC George Bundy, "We're eyeball to eyeball." And I think the other fellow just blinked. But the crisis wasn't over. The missiles were still in Cuba. Soviet submarines were operating in the Caribbean. American destroyers were hunting them. The submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes. The submarine commanders had authority to use them without direct orders from Moscow. If a submarine was attacked, the captain could decide to fire a nuclear weapon. One nuclear torpedo could destroy an entire naval task force. Could trigger retaliation, could start World War II. On October 27, the crisis reached its peak. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries in Cuba shot down an American U-2 spy plane. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed. Kennedy's military advisors pushed for immediate airstrikes. Invasion of Cuba within days. The Joint Chiefs of Staff believed war was inevitable. Better to strike first. At the same time, Soviet submarine B-59 was being hunted by American destroyers near the quarantine line. The submarine had been submerged for days. The crew was
Exhausted, the air conditioning had failed, the temperature inside was over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, carbon dioxide was building to dangerous levels. The captain had lost radio contact with Moscow. He didn't know if war had started. American destroyers were dropping depth charges. Practice charges intended to force the submarine to surface, but the Soviet crew didn't know they were practice charges. They thought they were under attack. The captain of B-59, Valentin Sitsky, decided to use his nuclear torpedo. He believed war had started. He believed his submarine was about to be destroyed. He wanted to take the American ships with him. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared. The political officer agreed, but Soviet regulations required agreement from all three senior officers. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued against using nuclear weapons. He convinced Savitsky to surface instead, to surrender instead, to live instead. Vasily Arkhipov may have saved the world that day. One man's decision, one refusal, one moment of restraint. When everything pushed toward escalation, the crisis ended on October 28. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The world stepped back from the edge. Nuclear conflict was narrowly avoided. Every United States Navy vessel in that quarantine line had been equipped with torpedoes using frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology, the very innovation Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil had created 2 decades earlier. The same technology the Navy had dismissed in 1942 as too cumbersome and impractical. The torpedoes functioned flawlessly. Soviet submarines were unable to jam the guidance signals, disrupt communications between American ships, or manipulate the control systems. The innovation that had been ignored in World War II now helped prevent a global confrontation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet Hedy Lamarr remained unaware. No one informed her. By 1962, she lived largely in seclusion. Her acting career had ended, her marriages all failed, and she rarely ventured out. She communicated with the outside world mainly by telephone. She had no knowledge that the military was employing her invention, no awareness that frequency hopping had become integral to U.S. naval communications, and no idea that her patent had been declassified and operationalized. Hedy continued acting through the 1940s and 1950s, with her biggest success being Samson and Delilah in 1949. Directed by Cecil B. DeMille, she portrayed the ultimate seductress, captivating Victor Mature's Samson. It was MGM's highest-grossing film at the time, but by the late 1950s, roles dwindled as Hollywood sought younger actresses. She made her final film in 1958. She married and divorced 6 times: Fritz Mundell, Jean Markey, John Loa, Teddy Stauffer, Howard Lee, Louis Boy. Every union ended in failure. She had 3 children and became increasingly reclusive, relocating to Florida, avoiding public appearances, and speaking on the phone for 6 to 7 hours daily, yet seldom seeing anyone in person. George Antheil died in 1959, the same year their patent expired, never knowing his invention would underpin modern wireless communication. In his 1945 memoir, he wrote that Hedy was exceptionally intelligent. Compared to most Hollywood actresses we know, Hedy is an intellectual giant. But the world ignored her brilliance. Over the decades, the technology evolved. Frequency hopping became spread spectrum, which then became the foundation for military, and later civilian, communications. By the 1980s, cell phone networks adopted variants of spread spectrum technology. By the 1990s, Wi-Fi emerged based on the same principles. Bluetooth, GPS, and every wireless system allowing multiple devices to communicate without interference all drew from frequency hopping concepts. By the mid-1990s, this technology was worth billions, omnipresent in phones, computers, and military systems, yet few knew its origins. Then in 1997, engineers at the Electronic Frontier Foundation researching wireless history discovered patent number 229-2387. They recognized the names H.D.I. Kiesler, Markey, and George Antheil, realizing Hedy Kiesler was Hedy Lamarr. They were astonished, an 83-year-old, reclusive former actress, the mother of Wi-Fi. The foundation decided to honor Lamarr and Antheil with the Pioneer Award in 1997. Contacting Hedy in Florida, she was shocked. She had assumed everyone had forgotten her patent and that it was worthless. She learned her invention formed the basis of $30 billion in wireless technology. When informed of the award, she reportedly said, "Well, it's about time." She also received the Bulbius Spirit of Achievement Award the same year, becoming the first woman to earn this accolade, known as the Oscar of Invention. Hetty did not attend either ceremony, too reclusive, concerned with her appearance, uncomfortable with public attention.
She accepted the awards by phone, gave a few interviews, expressing satisfaction that her work was recognized but avoiding visibility.
The world's most beautiful woman no longer wanted cameras. Hedy Lamarr passed away on January 19, 2000, in Castleberry, Florida, aged 85, from heart disease, at home in a modest three-bedroom house far from Hollywood. Her son, Anthony Loa, honored her wishes, scattering some ashes in the Vienna woods, where she had walked as a child with her father learning the workings of machines.
The remainder were interred in Vienna's Central Cemetery in 2014, alongside a memorial sculpture.
Lamarr never profited from frequency hopping. The patent had expired before implementation. She was recognized late in life but spent her final decades in relative obscurity. In 2014, 14 years posthumously, Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil were inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, alongside Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and the Wright brothers. Lamarr's story illustrates how brilliance is often dismissed when it emerges in unexpected forms. A Hollywood actress could not possibly understand radio engineering. A beautiful woman could not possibly invent military technology.
These assumptions were devastatingly wrong.
Her invention underpins every wireless technology used today: Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, cell phones, and military communications. All trace back to her June 1941 patent, inspired by a composer and an actress horrified by children drowning in the Atlantic, who sought better ways to combat submarines.
Google honored her with a doodle on her 101st birthday in 2015.
In 2019, asteroid 32730 was named Lamarr.
In 2023, Star Trek Prodigy featured a Lamarr-class starship. Recognition continues decades after her passing.
The 2017 documentary Bombshell, The Hedy Lamarr Story, recounts her life through late-life audio recordings, where her voice remains accented and distinct, discussing her inventions with matter-of-fact pride, without bitterness. This was the world she navigated. She was proud her invention succeeded, proud it helped, proud she was more than Hollywood demanded. Anthony Loa has tirelessly preserved his mother's legacy as an inventor, emphasizing her constant problem-solving. While the world demanded she be glamorous, she invented instead, thought instead, created instead.
In one of her last interviews, she remarked, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." She refused. She created. She thought. She innovated. And the world was wrong to expect otherwise. If you found this story compelling, take a moment to like this video. It helps share forgotten histories.
Subscribe to stay connected with untold stories.
Each one matters, each deserves remembrance. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from.